Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us into what is becoming one of the hottest topics in Brussels and in the EU, which is about semiconductors, microprocessors, and chips. We are seeing a very powerful digitalization trend that has been pushed forward by the COVID crisis that has exposed Europe on a need of the strategic importance of semiconductors. It has put this at the top of the EU agenda, and we're going to explore that today. But what we've also seen is that there are some important supply issues that need to be resolved. And the conflict that is at Europe's doorstep in Ukraine has clearly demonstrated and put a spotlight on this. What we'll discuss today is the CHIPS Act. We all agree that it can be a very important regulation, but what is needed is for it to deliver on its promise in boosting the EU's capabilities in the chip ecosystem. We're going to have a panel of experts made up from across the membership who are designers, who are the makers of these chips, but also, more importantly, they're users of the chips. We will explore today with important policymakers from across the EU a couple of important questions. Is Europe serious? Is it open for business? What parts of the CHIPS Act that needs to be clarified? Will the requirements that is laid out help or hurt production? Or worse, will it scare away investors? We have a clear view that this industry can contribute. We will communicate where that will happen. And it's important that industry does contribute because there's also a €1 trillion windfall worldwide by 2030 that all our economies can benefit from. We have the pleasure today to introduce some fantastic speakers. We have Lucilla Sioli. Everyone knows her from DG Connect. She's a director for digital industry at the European Commission and an important contributor and person that Digital Europe engages with. We have Stefano Pisotti, competitiveness coordinator at the Italian Perm Rep of the EU. Alberto Ruiz Rodríguez, industry attaché at the Spanish Perm Rep for the EU. We have Martin Pioch. He is the Senior Manager for European Affairs at ZVEI and the chair of our Digital Manufacturing Working Group, where we have discussions on the CHIPS Act. Magnus, Rentzhog, Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation of Sweden. Ricardo Mascucci, Director of Security and Technology Policy at Intel. Julia Jaseniska, Head of International Relations and Strategy Advocacy at Nokia. Daphne Delisson, Director of Global Government Affairs at Philips. And Jürgen Strum, who is the Director of Government Relations and Public Affairs at Texas Instruments, and also an important chair of our policy group on digital transformation. So now, without further ado, please allow me to give the floor to Martin from ZVEI. ZVEI is an important member of Digital Europe and a German trade association focusing on electro-digital industry. ZVEI has spent most of last year on a study analyzing the European chips market, and we are very honored to be collaborating with ZVEI on this topic. Martin, please, I give the floor to you to introduce Digital Europe's paper on the CHIPS Act.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you and with this very distinguished panel to discuss this very important topic on the CHIPS Act. It's key on our agenda in the Digital Europe Working Group on digital manufacturing. And maybe just a couple of beginning remarks, and then I have 2 slides on what we have done or where we are at the moment. Definitely, we as industry welcome the CHIPS Act. I think this is very important to say. The CHIPS Act gives us, or gives Europe, the chance to strengthen the whole value chain, and that's important, of the European microelectronics ecosystem, and therefore benefits our European society and economy. Europe has many downstream industry. Yeah, some of them are also presented here in the panel today, but it's important that we create a constructive dialogue between downstream industry and manufacturers to really strengthen the future of chip production, microelectronics in our economy in Europe. I would ask for the next slide. We have put together a position paper in Digital Europe in the last 4 weeks since the presentation of the CHIPS Act. And what we lay out is, first of all, the situation that we have right now. Europe's share of global semiconductor production has declined from 22% to 8% today. So we are at the moment at 8% of global production. We know that in the digital decade in March last year, the Commission announced a very ambitious goal to reach 20% of semiconductor production in Europe. This is very good. It's a very important target. And we also see an increasing demand in semiconductors across all sectors. We have here a couple of them listed. For example, the 3-time growth of semiconductor value in the automotive industry worldwide, because there's a huge transformation going on in this sector, but also in 70% of medtech companies have chips in over 50% of their products, and it's just increasing. And we expect the global semiconductor market until 2030 to double. So that would mean if we from Europe want to go from 8% to 20% and the market doubles, we need a kind of a roughly 4 to 5 times growth of chip production to reach this goal. So it's really an important moment of time at the beginning of this new 20s and to boost chip production. So what we have studied very, very carefully is now the proposals from the Commission. And I asked to go on the next slide. We have a couple of 4 key requests which are adjusted to those who know the CHIPS Act has 3 pillars and the governance structure. So very roughly here, what we as Digital Europe feel that definitely there's a lot of good and beneficial content in the CHIPS Act proposal, but there needs to be a couple of clarifications to make it a little bit better for industry. So the first thing we say is clarify terms and conditions for the development and access to the design platforms and pilot lines in Pillar 1. So you see industry was really interested and wants to start with these projects, but and really wants to use this, even if we still have to wait a little bit until the proposal is enacted. And then, but still, there's a huge interest in that area. Secondly, we asked to add details on the eligibility criteria for the European first-of-kind semiconductor facilities, and foresee continued operating support for the facilities in exceptional circumstances. Again, here we know that those first-of-a-kind facilities are already right now possible to establish, and we have projects ready to go. But again, a little bit clarification there would be good to help companies to really start building, start implementing, be rapid, and therefore reach the goals that the European Union has set itself. The third is that we ask for an EU central entity for reporting requirements. At the moment, the CHIPS Act foresees that each member state is gathering information in the Pillar 3 and then puts them together in reports them to the Commission. That might be a little bit patchworky. Also, there might be problems on the confidentiality with the reporting requirements. I think here we can still improve a little bit more. This is a highly important tech sector. There's a lot of confidential information, and companies need to feel comfortable to share those information. I think this is really key. The willingness is there, but it's key to have these requirements. And fourth, you can expect this from an industry association like we as ZVEI are one, or Digital Europe is one, of course. We think a little bit greater industrial involvement in the governance would be welcomed. This is probably foreseen, maybe not written down in CHIPS Act, but it's in practice. And in practice, I think it's super important if we want to learn the lesson from the chip crisis that we had in the past during COVID. We need a sustainable and fruitful dialogue between manufacturers and downstream industries. Many of the obstacles might be overcome, or we don't even have to use all of the tools of the toolbox if we establish this dialogue. If companies are just looking at themselves and not at the whole value chain production, and then they cancel orders and want to start orders again, this is complicated for an industry where the creation of the chips takes up to 6 months. So therefore, this dialogue, this platform is key of interest. We know the Semiconductor Alliance will kick off pretty soon. And I think that is very important, that this dialogue is a first step to deal in a situation of crisis, that, to bring the stakeholders together. With that, I think it's a what is right now very, very important is to really reach the goals of the Commission and to enable European technological leadership also in the area of semiconductors, where we are super strong in some areas. I mentioned power electronics, sensors. We have probably gaps and weaknesses in other areas. There we have ambitious goals right now to also go in this direction. There are new materials. There's a lot of things are going on. What is right now very important is that those projects which are ready to start, which are ready to kick off, have a very rapid and swift implementation, be it in an IPCI, be it in a Pillar 2 of the CHIPS Act, be it other investment, be it a whole wonderful research part in Pillar 1. But I think it's important to really kick off and start. And therefore, that's our introduction. Our position paper from Digital Europe is on the website. It's published today. You can all take a look at it. And yeah, without further ado, giving the floor to Vincenzo, who moderates the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Martin, for your overview of Digital Europe messages on the CHIPS Act. And thanks very much also, Ray, for your introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Vincenzo Renda, Senior Policy Manager at Digital Europe, and I'll be the moderator of this first event in our Digital Deep Dive series. As the title says, we're gonna dive into some of the key aspects that Martin has just addressed. So we're very happy to hear from our speakers today on what you agree and maybe even disagree on, as we want this to be an interactive discussion. So I really invite any of the speakers today in our roundtable to take the floor and react to anything that other speakers have said if they wish to do so. So for the same reason, to make this interactive, also invite our attendees to submit any question they may have. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address your questions to speakers. So I want to start off with Stefano, and I want to open this debate by focusing on this key goal in the CHIPS Act, which is that of boosting production capacity in the EU. There is a clear goal, we know, it's a very ambitious one by the EU, is to host 20% of global chip production by 2030. So Martin earlier highlighted this steady decline of chip making capacity in Europe over the last couple of decades, essentially. So I really want to ask you, how can the EU increase production capacity of chips in the long term?
Thank you, Vincenzo, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and exchange views with you on this very important topic. First of all, let me tell you that we, of course, I mean, we welcome very much the CHIPS Act. We were strongly advocated for a dedicated instrument aimed at boosting the capacity of Europe to produce microchips and also to be more competitive and autonomous in this field, as the European industry and the many Italian sectors, especially in manufacturing, automotive, and others, badly need more chips and a more stable offer. So we very much welcome the initiative, and we also welcome the integrated approach of the CHIPS Act. We think it's very important that it links very well research, innovation, but also industrial policy, competition policy, investments, along also with the external dimension, because it's very important to be able to create a level playing field also in this sector. At the same time, we think that there are several challenges. I just mention a couple. The first one is financial resources. The Commission has estimated 43 billion euros that can be, let's say, that are policy driven by the Act. We of course hope that this estimate is correct. Of course, I mean the private sector contribution will be key. So that the first thing and the first challenge is actually, as also Ray and Martin have mentioned is to be able to attract investments. So first, legal certainty, very clear rules for investors and stakeholders. Second, time also is of the essence. We know that there will be basically two processes that will run in parallel in a way. The first one is the assessment of the first of a kind nature of investments and facilities that of course should be as quick as possible. And the second one will be the assessment of the public support that will be needed to close the financing gap under the state aid rules. So these two processes should be, of course, streamlined and be clear, and in terms of the time they need to be completed for stakeholders and industry to engage. I think this is the first. I don't want to be too long. The other challenge is the involvement of all the EU ecosystem. All the ecosystem should be mobilized, and this I think is not I mean easy an easy task because of course I mean there will be also competition among member states and companies and also in terms of research centers, for example, to access the research and development funds made available by the Act. I mean the seat of the pilot lines that are provided for, and also of course to attract foreign investments. So we have to strike the right balance between competition and cooperation, and be able to involve all the relevant actors of the ecosystem in order to be able to achieve this ambitious goal to increase steadily and very and quite rapidly also the production capacity in Europe.
Thanks very much, Stefano, for your points. Magnus, what do you think of that? What does the EU need to do to increase chip production?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on this show. It's good to be here. I already two speakers had turned to legal certainty when it comes to Pillar 2, and I think that is, from our point of view, also a key point that these new provisions on the Pillar 2, you know, it has to be clarified what is first of a kind, how does it work, what's the long-term value of being one of these new functions. So that has to be clarified. I think that is key on the Pillar 2. Also that there should be no doubt that this is a non-discriminatory pillar. It's not only for Europe, but it's for the entire world. I think that it has to be very clear. So first of a kind, need clarifications there, and then be clear about this is open to the world and not only for Europe, as from our point of view, key point. And we also like to see, I mean, there's, when we talk about this, is there a risk of member states competing for these new first of a kind investments? And that's something we would like to avoid seeing. And also, again, I mean, Pillar 2, you know, this is a very special sector, and it's hard to avoid discussion on subsidies and so forth. And also a key message from our point of view would be, you know, be very careful when it comes to any possible hampering of current state aid rules and so forth. I mean, that it's served us well a long time, and we should be careful to hamper the rules here when it comes to subsidies and state aid. So that would be Pillar 2 from our point of view. But I would say that the key to the answer on the Pillar 2 lies in Pillar 1. We agree that the main thrust should be in Pillar 1. If we want a long-term, stable, well-developed ecosystem, pillar one is the key, focusing on the entire ecosystem and on the entire EU. So we don't just focus on, you know, the latest and the greatest and the smallest and the fastest, but the entire ecosystem. I mean, there's a broad range of semiconductors from, you know, mass market to specialized solutions, and we need the entire range and should be able to you know, develop everything, they should not just be focused on the latest and greatest. Here I would like to highlight competence as an issue that we see. If we're going to succeed, competence will be absolutely critical. It's the first thing our companies tell us is the lack of competency in Sweden, in Europe. We need to do that. I mean, it's a fast-moving market, fast-moving innovation situation, and competence gets old really fast. So we need to find ways to really succeed here. I mean, this is a part of Pillar 1 discussion, and we have suggestions there, but we need to step up and see if there are other solutions. What can the industry itself do to spread knowledge among, you know, to other companies and to subcontractors and so forth? What can we do to help ourselves here, and also help us as regulators? You know, teach me how to do this. And you know, I'm not an expert on semiconductors, but I need to understand. It will make life harder for me, because the more I know, the more gray the answer will be. But it's probably in the end we come up with better policy responses if we know more about the sector and the solution. So that is my initial thought. I mean, on you know, Pillar 2, legal certainty is a key. We need to work on that, and I think Pillar 1 is the key, especially competence. So that would be my starting point. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Magnus. I like this point on how the success of Pillar 2 relies actually on Pillar 1. That's a good element that I would like to discuss later on. Now let's move to industry and chip makers in particular. Ricardo, Intel, your company, has recently announced new chip investments in Europe, including in some of the countries which are represented today on stage. And I'm curious to know, has the CHIPS Act proposal helped to secure these investments, and really, how can the EU ensure that it will hit this 20% target by 2030?
Thanks, Vincenzo, and good morning, everyone. Indeed, the EU CHIPS Act can be a catalyst for large investments, like the one we recently announced. The CHIPS Act has the merit to acknowledge the need to increase manufacturing capacity and making really the security of supply chain a key pillar of the overall strategy. This is timely, considering the fact that there is a decades-long decline in manufacturing in Europe, but there is also an increase in consumption, an increase in demand of semiconductors in Europe, and Europe is currently dependent on Asia. We need to revert all these trends, and it's critical to make large investments in large first-of-a-kind manufacturing facilities. So one point that was already mentioned, and it's probably a key element of a mix that is needed to increase long-term capacity in Europe, is investments and resources. And the CHIPS Act aims at mobilizing those appropriate resources, both from the private sector and the member states. Now, previous speakers also talked about innovation. That is another key element. And actually the focus on first-of-a-kind facilities will actually help drive innovations in Europe. This goal is clear, not just in the definition of first-of-a-kind facilities that are going beyond what is state-of-art today in Europe, but also in the commitment to invest in the next generation chips, as long as this requirement, as we write in our paper, is also practical. So if we look at more innovation, more R&D, these elements will certainly contribute, as Magnus was hinting, to strengthen the ecosystem and the production capacity. This will also bring another key element besides investments, besides innovation, another key element is talent. So the digital talent pipeline in Europe is critical for the long-term production. And the presence of talent will itself foster manufacturing capacity, will benefit the industrial ecosystem, and will also attract more in private investments in the long term in Europe. A fourth essential element for this increase in manufacturing capacity is definitely also the presence of faster procedures and in general a more favorable regulatory environment. This is what Digital Europe praises in the position paper. So the CHIPS Act makes semiconductor manufacturing a priority. It considers semiconductor manufacturing in public interest. And so all these facilities will likely benefit from fast-track procedures for authorizations and permits. And last but not least, in this mix of elements that will make the EU CHIPS Act successful, it's the possibility that the Digital Europe's paper refers to, the possibility for long-term operating support for the new manufacturing facilities. So long-term incentives to sustain the long-term viability of all these projects. This is due to the fact that the semiconductor manufacturing currently faces significant cost disadvantages in the EU compared to other locations. And so the Digital Europe paper suggests more discussions on potential policy instruments to ensure financial viability for the entire lifetime of semiconductor facilities. Other jurisdictions that have vibrant semiconductor ecosystems are, for instance, proposing tax credits, special tax rates. So all these policy instruments should probably be part of the debate if we want to look at the long-term viability and long-term success of production capacity in Europe. Thanks, Vincenzo, and everyone.
Thanks a lot, Ricardo, for your comments. And now we come to you, Lucilla, as a Commission representative and the proponent of the Act. I'm very keen to hear from you on these points. You've heard the member states, you've heard the chip makers. So really, I'd like to hear from you how Pillar 2 can help the EU hit in the digital decade target on semiconductors. And it'd be great if you can also elaborate on Magnus' points earlier on really what qualifies as first-of-a-kind facility, and on this interesting point that he shared on how the success of the Pillar 2 relies also on Pillar 1. What do you think of that?
Thanks a lot for inviting me here today, first of all. And thanks also for these very positive comments I've just heard and the deep understanding already I can see on the industry and the policy side of those who are really going to engage in the CHIPS Act. So let me start from the first of a kind, which is the fact that the European Union is simply saying that it will look favorably at those facilities that will make an investment that is first of a kind in the European Union, meaning that it is bringing the most innovative technologies in the European Union compared to the state of the art at that moment in time. And I know that many interpret this as being simply capabilities of these fabs to produce at lower technology nodes. But it is not only that. If you look at the definition of first of a kind, which you can find in Article 2 of the CHIPS Act, you will see that it refers both to, yes, chips that are produced at lower technology nodes, but also chips that have innovative functionalities, or chips that have very innovative kinds of energy consumption, but also plants that have processes that are environmentally friendly. And so there are many angles to the innovation that can be taken into account in the first of a kind that should really be able to cater for many different kinds of investment. And as it was said earlier by many of the participants, innovation is key to make sure that these investments are long-term. And in fact, one of the commitments that we also ask to those that in particular are looking for public subsidies and invest in first-of-a-kind technologies that are also able to commit to invest in next-generation chips. So any kind of investment, which can be making space for pre-production facilities for the next generation of chips, or simply make sure you have, you know, a big R&D investment in related technology, that is going to be looked at favorably for a way of making the investment in the European Union long term. And of course, this investment has to have a positive impact on the economy of the European Union, not only in the country where this investment takes place, and therefore we will be looking at the impacts that these plans can make, and in favor of different companies and the industrial ecosystem of the European Union. For example, a foundry system where a manufacturing company is actually also producing for the other design companies can help in stimulating design, strengthening of design in the European Union. For what concerns the link with Pillar 1, I think Magnus was spot on in identifying the fact that at the same time we are strengthening Europe's capabilities in developing the next generation of chips through different technological approaches. And we have established the possibility for manufacturing facilities in the European Union to have a preferential way of accessing the pilot lines that we will be supporting under Pillar 1. But it is perfectly correct to see that taken together, Pillar 2 and Pillar 1, I also think Pillar 3 goes in that direction, really help the growth of the ecosystem now and in the years to come. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucilla, for your points. We got a question from the audience, and it's directed to Magnus. You mentioned before that it's important that there is no race for state aid in the EU. That should be prevented. But what do you think should be the measure to consider here?
I mean, from our point of view, first of all, EU budget should not be used in this. It should be member state money. But it has to do with the concern. One of the key concerns we have that we need clarification, but and this might not be a problem, but we need clarification is here. I mean, it's when do you become first of a kind? And what does it mean for other countries when a company has, you know, get the stamp of being first of a kind, and another company is doing basically the same thing? Are they then out of it? Should member states, you know, rush to grant one company the stamp of approval, and then what happens to the other countries? So, I mean, we just need clarifications and understand this concept. I buy the point that, and I think it's very good that the definition is very broad. That should not be about nanomillimeters, but from our point of view, the green angle, the energy consumption is hugely important for the green transition and so forth, considering the environmental impact of production. But for us, what I'm trying to get across is just to understand more about. So if one company gets approval as being first of a kind, then another company is doing basically the same thing, or developing this kind of solution, can't they be first of a kind? And what happens to possible, you know, if one country is supporting with state aid the first company, what happens to the other country, and should they try to rush approval there and so forth? It's just have to understand the practical implications of this, but and again, just to reiterate that our main point is that the rules we have today has worked very well. I mean, it is a sector full of subsidies, like it or not, but you know, that doesn't mean that the fundamental rules we have in Europe should be ignored.
Thanks a lot, Magnus. I would like now to move to information sharing and crisis response in the CHIPS Act regulation. So Pillar 3, which Commissioner Breton said it is a framework that was also inspired by the US Defense Production Act. Alberto, we're today in the middle of a chip shortage. Some analysts say it may still take 1 to 2 years for this current shortage to ease. But for the future, what is the most effective way to respond to chip crisis?
Well, thank you, Vincenzo, and good morning to all. First of all, it is a pleasure to be in this event, and thank you to Digital Europe for organizing it, because I think it comes in a timely manner and will certainly provide for a good contribution for the discussions that we are currently holding in the Council. In Spain, we are still carrying out an open consultation of the proposal at national level. And in this sense, I encourage Spanish companies that are connected to the event to participate in it. That means that we do not have final positions on the proposals, but we do have some positions that I'm able to share with you. Coming to the question you asked me, I think one of the lessons we can draw from the COVID-19 crisis is how important it is to maintain open and connected supply chains of essential goods as part of our crisis response strategies. And another lesson we can draw is the need to reduce dependencies and strengthen our own supply chains. In the case of semiconductors, both aspects are equally important, as it is a global supply chain in which Europe cannot become self-sufficient. To tackle potential bottlenecks that slow down growth, we think it is important to work on partnerships with like-minded countries in order to create more balanced interdependencies, and also to avoid single points of failure and build supply chains that can be trusted. In this regard, we think the work that is currently being undertaken under the EU-US Trade and Technology Council is very promising, and that it could be replicated with other countries. At a more regional level in Europe, and looking at Pillar 3 of the CHIPS Act proposal, we think that setting up a coordination mechanism between the member states and the Commission is a positive measure for monitoring the supply of semiconductors, and also to respond to disruptions in the event of a crisis. It is important to set up correct early warning indicators with a clear methodology, and also to have a good understanding of the value chain, so that member states are able to identify the key market actors and to monitor the functioning of the value chain as a whole, and not only the supply chain. It is only by having the right criteria that we will be able to determine when we are likely to face a crisis and to anticipate to it successfully. For this reason, we think that the definition of the exact preconditions that will lead to the activation of the crisis stage is very important, and will need comprehensive discussions taking into account all relevant actors. Once the crisis stage is activated, tools used during the COVID-19 crisis, such as the common purchasing mechanism or export controls, might be considered, as they have proven to be useful under the current crisis. However, we think special attention should be paid to the scope of the emergency measures that the Commission has to take in the crisis stage. In particular, when it comes to priority rated orders of crisis-relevant products, clear rules and compensations should be set, and there should be no clashes with free market rules. In the case of undertakings subject to third country priority rated orders, the measure should be legally sound and ensure compliance with international law, given the extraterritorial scope of this measure. Finally, to ensure an appropriate response to future chips crisis, we think the good functioning of the single market has to be preserved, regardless the geographical location or the origin of the state aid received by the integrated production facilities and open EU foundries that are meant to accept and prioritize the orders. As you see, and as previous speakers already pointed out, the three pillars of the proposals are interlinked, and this is indeed a very difficult topic that will require deep discussions due to its relevance in the general framework of the CHIPS Act.
Thank you, Alberto. Let's hear now from actors in downstream industries that use chips. And I want to turn to you now, Julia. Nokia relies on chips and can say that industry players obviously want to protect commercially valuable, sensitive data that they hold. So when it comes to this information sharing framework in the CHIPS Act, how can the EU strike a balance between greater transparency in supply chains and the need to really minimize any risk of exposing confidential data?
Thank you, Vincenzo. And as for the start, I want to thank you for getting me here on the panel. Nokia is on one hand involved in chips design. We have activities across several countries. On the other hand, we of course rely on procurement of chips, all kinds of chips. We have a dedicated organization with several employees, whose sole focus is only to maintain relations with our suppliers and secure necessary inputs for components for Nokia. So I understand that in order to manage the supply chain, to understand the supply chain, it takes huge expertise, and a lot of confidential information are involved in, for instance, defining the pricing levels. Chips are very specialized and its supply chain is very global. So it's a very complex situation to navigate and to understand. So how to support, answer, and be better prepared for future crises? Well, here my answer would be invest in global capacity. So that's what we've discussed just before, right? Now, on the concrete response measures for the shortage situation as proposed, it is very wise that the EU wants to boost its understanding of what's going on and that the monitoring mechanism is being proposed. But it needs to be, first of all, streamlined. So we as industry know whom to contact if we would like to supply any information as necessary, ideally at the central level rather than having the reporting obligations potentially in different member states. That's point number one. Point number two is about the confidentiality, which you introduced in your question, because many of the industry confidential data are involved here. And then, of course, there are also other support and response measures introduced here or proposed here. And we need to think about whether they are implementable and whether they are practical. So for instance, the joint procurement that was just mentioned before, I think the idea at the conceptual level is interesting, but one needs to think whether there is enough capacity on the institutional level to really understand and like what we do, building relations with suppliers over the years, would the EU institutional players be able to step in and secure the supply that we may at moments struggle with such a big variance of chips across the industry that an industrial needs. If there is not enough chips supplied, because probably that would be the situation we are talking about, the crisis responses. So I would expect that there would not be sufficient chips, but say 80% of it. Then what would be the allocation mechanism? That becomes very politicized, the conversations. So is that practical? And export controls. We need, as European industry, access to chips which go through a global process and global supply chain. So it could be that the European input, say European substrate, is needed to be processed elsewhere in the globe to then come back as an input for the European industry. So all of that needs to be well considered for a measured and accurate action, so that we don't actually further disrupt and disturb the availability on the market rather than support it.
Thanks a lot, Julia. And let's turn now the focus on Daphne. You also represent a chip user in the medtech space, Philips. And as we know, medtech equipment for applications like medical imaging or healthcare IT depend also on chips. So what do you think of this proposed coordination mechanism in Pillar 3 of the CHIPS Act?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Vincenzo, for allowing me to be part of this this first deep dive, and also to share the view of the downstream industry, because Philips, as many EU medtech companies, have been impacted by this global shortage of semiconductors, and we have experienced severe disruptions in our supply chain, and these disruptions vary from delays that could take between 2 to more than 52 weeks, cancellation orders, short orders, and the expectation is that the situation will deteriorate in 2022. And some members of our industry even forecast that allocations will be down by 70 to 90%, so that's 90. And of course, this will result in lines being down for life-saving equipment. And we have been struggling to navigate the entire value chain because due to the lack of transparency, it's very difficult for us to assess being further down the supply chain, sometimes up to 4 or 5 tiers away from the foundry level, for example, to really assess where the bottlenecks are. So therefore, we do welcome the proposal for the EU Chip Act, and we also commend the commitment of the EU policymakers to really address the shortage of semiconductors. And I do believe that the coordination mechanism between the member states and the Commission will be able to contribute to prevent future shortages. But I would also like to underline some of the comments that Julia already made, that of course we need to really look carefully about how we design this mechanism. And I think it's also very important, as is also one of the key elements of the position paper of Digital Europe, is that industry plays a very pivotal role in that exchange. That is not just the member states and the Commission, but we really need to involve industry in order to understand what is a very complex ecosystem, at least from our perspective. And I think this has already been pointed out also by Magnus, that it's not just about the greatest and the latest, because especially in the medtech industry, and I think this also applies to other important industries in the European Union, we pretty much rely on second and third generation chips. And we also need to make sure that the European Union also makes sure that those generations are still available. And then, from the medtech industry, I think, great steps forward in the proposal of the EU Chip Act, but we need to recognize that we are in a crisis right now, and we cannot wait for the EU Chip Act to be adopted, because we are facing these challenges in 2022. So I think it's also very important that the European Commission also issued the recommendation together with the proposal, calling on member states to act now in the semiconductor expert group to already start using the toolbox that was suggested, and try and see what we can do, member states, European Commission, together with industry, to tackle the issues that we are currently facing, because we simply cannot wait. And as an industry, we just at least need to make sure that the current level of demand, which for medtech is very small, we represent about 1% of global demand, so it's really not that much, that we continue to secure our allocations, and that we already start working on a better understanding of how the supply chain operates and where the bottlenecks really are. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Daphne. Lucilla, on this point on crisis response, what makes a framework that was successful in dealing with the vaccine production also a good one, an effective one, a replicable one, also when it comes to chips? And it'd be also good if you could just share your views on what Julia shared before on this common purchasing approach, and how would the allocation of chips happen in that framework? Over to you.
Thank you for these comments. So let me say, first of all, that indeed the approach that we have presented in the CHIPS Act is inspired by the experience we had with the vaccines and the experience that we also had as importers of these vaccines. It is also inspired by some of the activities that, for example, can be taken by the United States. And so we wanted to, we noticed some of the actions that they can take and wanted to be able to take also similar actions because they can be very useful indeed. Now, when it comes to the emergency toolbox that has been summarized by the speakers, first of all, it is important to notice that we can only use it when we declare a situation of crisis. So it cannot be used at all times freely by the Commission and the Member States whenever they like. There is a very strong process that is suggested which involves the Committee of Member States to be able to trigger a crisis. And we are in a crisis now, but we will have to see whether we are actually able, with the instruments that we have at our availability at the moment, to counter the very current crisis. In fact, the recommendation does give some capabilities to the European Commission and the Member States in terms of some of the actions that have been highlighted until now, but not as much as we can have once the CHIPS Act is adopted, because what's in the regulation in terms of measurement, in terms of tools available to the Commission, is a bit stronger than what is in the recommendation. But still, I want to highlight that our work with the Member States through the recommendation has already started, and we will be soon carrying out a survey of the value chain that should give us information that we need to understand the needs. We will try to, pay a lot of attention to the confidentiality issues, as it has been highlighted by some of the speakers earlier. And we are aware of the fact that you don't have volume chips, like, for example, the ones of healthcare that were highlighted by Daphne earlier. It is very difficult that the very few foundries that exist in the world are actually going to prioritize the production of those chips. And so that's why we think we need an intervention at the European level, which is a more central level than if the intervention comes from each individual member state, which can leverage its bargaining power and then maybe play a more important role in the acquisition of the chips that are needed. But of course, first step for us is to be able to map the value chain, to understand the needs of this value chain, and then we can really put in place all the instruments that we addressed together with the member states. And let's not forget that the member states play a very important role through now the expert group, in the future, the semiconductor board, and it will be together that we will be able to collaborate and really face the shortages. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lucilla. I want to pick up a question from the audience and ask to speakers to react briefly on this point. But the question is essentially, when it comes to global cooperation, for example, the TTC, how will the TTC address concretely the CHIPS Act? Lucilla, you want to give a quick reaction on that?
Yes, we are discussing, for example, on the identification of disruptions of the supply chain, because the value chain is global. So we can try to map and monitor the value chain and the supply chain in the European Union, but obviously we need to work with the United States and with Japan and with other partners to see, the supply chain disruptions can come from other parts of the world. So the interaction with the global, with third countries is extremely important. And we are discussing, for example, to create an alert mechanism whereby we can alert each other in case of identification of a supply chain disruption. And we are also working together to develop mechanisms to facilitate the understanding of the demand because if you can understand the true demand, you can also understand, you can also derive indicators for possible supply chain disruptions. I know you're not seeing me. I apparently have some connection problems, but I hope you can hear me.
Indeed, we can hear you very well. Thank you. On this point on global cooperation, Ricardo, you want to comment quickly on that?
Yes, thanks, Vincenzo. Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. Definitely an important point here. We need to rebalance the global supply chain, limiting single points of failure. And so this collaboration with other countries is critical. Lucilla just said that the nature of the semiconductor supply chain, as well as the modern digital infrastructure, is by definition global. And so we cannot work in silos. And the semiconductor industry needs to leverage the different segments across all the regions. So Europe should continue building on its strengths like fab equipment or research and development, but also increase its capabilities in leading edge design and manufacturing by partnering with other countries that face similar challenges, the US, Japan, and others in Asia. So the TCC is actually can be a platform to coordinate these efforts, and semiconductors can probably be the testbed for renewed transatlantic collaboration to make semiconductors supply chains more resilient, to regain technology leadership, to create also mechanisms to address future shortages.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. Magnus, I'd like to have your views on global cooperation and the role of TTC. And if I can ask you to be brief, so we'll move to the next topic. Thanks.
No, I think I mean, from our point of view, international cooperation is key for us. Pillar 3, I would say, we very much about crisis avoidance. So some good points taken up here about industry involvement, international industry involvement, and we can have in international cooperation and European involvement in the ECB. So I think that is an information gathering about how the global value chain looks in other countries and like that. So nothing further to add to that, but just to say that crisis avoidance should be the target on the pillar 3, and this is an essential step of that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Magnus. Now, Stefano, I think it's fair to say that the industry supports the ambition of the Commission in the CHIPS Act proposal. What is the role you see for industry in the implementation of it?
Yes, of course. As I also mentioned in the my first intervention, the role of industry is essential. Let me just focus maybe on the demand side here, the downstream, let's say, because I think that here, I mean, we still see the risk of kind of storage or shortage, of supply for more mature chips in terms of technology for several manufacturing industries. We perceive this let's say preoccupation by some industry in Italy, automotive, machinery, and so forth. So in a way, the risk is that notwithstanding this effort we are putting on the table, we will not in the end overcome the shortage we are experiencing, and we get stuck in a kind of permanent dependence on chips. Of course, I mean, the idea itself of first of a kind, it's I mean, it's an innovative idea and concept, and we support it, but we have to make sure that industry can can receive all the supply it needs to flourish. Also, as I mentioned, with the current technology and the current status of chips they actually need. So we have to make sure that in the implementation of the first of a kind, I mean the approach should be sufficiently wide to promote investments that are not necessarily a breakthrough or disruptive. I think that also Daphne mentioned this need, and I was reassured by Lucilla's remarks on this. So I think that I mean also the Commission is aware of the need to, of course, to promote innovation, but also to foster the capacity of production in Europe or of more mature chips, of course, with some feature of innovation in it, be it process or environmental, let's say, targets. This was my first remark. The second is, this is also what was mentioned by others, but I would like to highlight it myself, the full involvement of industry in the monitoring and assessing the global and also the European supply chain. I think it will be essential. Of course, I mean they have the knowledge and really the sense of the supply chain functioning, and so they should be fully involved in this process, and also in order to conceive the remedies to potential shortages. So I think that the only way to effectively foresee and also to prevent shortages and to react timely to severe disruptions and of supply chains would be to fully consult and have a very close contact with industry in the process. So this is, I mean, in a nutshell, my answer to your questions on the role of industry. As I said, I focused on the downstream segment, and of course, I mean, there are other ways industry could provide its contribution, but I think this is very key.
Thanks, Stefano, for your point, and I would like to turn to Jürgen. Stefano raised this important point on the involvement of industry in addressing some of the complex topics that are covered in the CHIPS Act, and I would like to ask you, how do you see businesses helping the public sector in addressing those many different complex topics in the CHIPS Act?
Thank you very much, Vincenzo, for the question. I have been honestly listening very attentively, and I agree with almost most or almost everything what has been said. I would like to go maybe one step back before I reply to your question and take a look at why are we in the situation where we are today. I think this is an assessment what we still need to do. A lot of thought, a lot of thinking has gone into that already. But what we have to see is that this whole crisis situation started in an era of the pandemic 2 years ago, where the demand has increased significantly. So we see, for instance, electromobility really kicking in now. We see factory automation really kicking in. We see the digitization of our factories is what has been a concept maybe 5 years ago is materializing today, and that's a great development that we see, but also it had, of course, then an impact on the chip supply, because the demand has just grown in an environment where there was a certain expectation that the economy on a global scale may go down, and that was not the case. And then as a third thing, well, there were supply chains interruptions which we never probably will be able to prevent. There were the big snows in the south of Texas. We had power shortages in Japan. So all that is water shortages in Taiwan. So all that has happened, and that contributed to some sort of a perfect storm. And I think when we now look beyond and look to the future, we have to leave from that assessment that we had an extraordinary situation in 2020, 2021, which hopefully in this form does not repeat itself, but insofar we have to find the solutions for the future, not necessarily only based on an assessment of the last 2 years. And that means I think we need a much more closer collaboration between industry, member states, and the Commission and industry. I mean downstream industry and manufacturers. Because also there may be already challenges in the communication along the value chain between the downstream industry and the manufacturers, which can be solved without political interference. So we need to draw the line there. When do we really talk of a crisis? Then it may be justified to have political action, but that's the last recourse. I think many of the issues, but what we have been experiencing in the last 2 years, they can and should be addressed along the stakeholders, along the value chain. Because why I'm saying that, if we have a crisis, then I think it is important that the toolbox which is applied is the correct one, because by then we have no time anymore to discuss options. Then this has to be a feasible thing. And that's why I think we have to take a look between industry, Commission, member states at the toolbox. Is it feasible? Is it really helping? Is it solving the issue? And that requires, I think, a much more institutionalized joint thinking in terms of, well, what are the particular peculiarities of the semiconductor industry to be taken into account when such a toolbox is developed. So there are, in Pillar 3, we still see a number of open questions which need to be addressed very much on the detail level. I can understand the reasoning, I can understand the thinking behind, that's no doubt. But we have to have in place, once the CHIPS Act is adopted, we have to have in place a toolbox which is feasible, which is functioning, which is implementable. And that's why I think what is very important is that we get the European Semiconductor Alliance off the ground very, very soon now. In order to bridge this time gap, Digital Europe has taken an initiative to coordinate among a number of industry associations from the manufacturing sector, and based on that, I think we will need to have very institutional, general, and permanent talks with the political stakeholders in order to get the Pillar 3 right. At the moment, unfortunately, I see it more a little bit as a theoretical exercise, which needs to undergo the praxis, the reality check. Yeah? And so this is what I think we can offer from Digital Europe side to foster, to host, to accommodate, to organize this discussion, because that's very, very necessary, because we have only one shot free. Yeah? In the next, if a crisis will happen, then we have to have the tools in place, and then they need to function, and they need to be well done. And duration from the US Defense Act. If I'm correctly informed, this was applied at the beginning of the pandemic to ask the US automotive industry to produce ventilators for hospitals. Yeah, you can do this when you have an automotive industry which is on short labor, but probably cannot use this tool for a chip factory which runs at 90–95% capacity, what they usually.
We're having some issues in hearing you, Jürgen, breaking up, but I think your points are clear, and I would just like to ask. Thanks a lot, Jürgen. Lucilla, do you want to comment on these points? And I would also like to ask you, where do you see the added value of industry in rolling out the CHIPS Act?
Well, the role of industry is key in the CHIPS Act, in all the pillars. Certainly in Pillar 1, which is research, innovation, and capacity building, we expect industry to participate in the activities, in helping the RTOs in setting up pilot lines, in using the pilot lines, in accessing design infrastructure. So really, the role of industry in Pillar 1 is crucial. In Pillar 2, of course, we expect investment for production capabilities, but also investment in design and in the whole ecosystem that we expect these production facilities to really fuel. And in the third pillar, I think Jürgen was right in saying it cannot be just a business. Facing shortages is not just the business of Commission and Member States. It has to involve industry as well. And we will have a first meeting of the Alliance for Semiconductors actually very soon. And there in the Alliance, we also look at bringing together both the chips makers with the user industry. We actually seek for representation of the value chain. But obviously there is a role to play, an important role to play also for the user industry, including in our monitoring. I mean, we do intend to ask the user industries whether they're experiencing problems, whether they have specific needs. And then we see where we, as the European Commission and the Member State, can actually help in moments of crisis. So, as I said, the role of industry is crucial. And we will make sure, in particular through the Alliance for Semiconductors, that industry is involved. Industry will have the possibility to participate to meetings of the Semiconductor Board, for example, as needed. And so we, interact with industry, and we intend to do so even on an even more regular basis than we have done so far in terms of what is needed for investment, legal certainty, and all the questions that, of course, industry is raising at this moment in time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lucilla. You mentioned downstream industry, so I turn to you, Julia. Do you want to comment briefly on the involvement of industry in rolling out the CHIPS Act, in the governance of this piece of law?
Thank you. Actually, so much has been said already that I can only say it's fantastic that you want the industry to be there. As industry, you see that we are interested. This event and many others testify to that. Luckily, Europe has successful industry and excellence in for instance, in the chips design, in some of the strategic segments like the telco sector, and you have other players which are there to play their part too. So I think that's a good position to start with, and we need to ensure that the voices of the industry are indeed heard and consulted to well pick and focus the intervention to really obtain technological leadership in selected and the most strategic segments, rather than try to do everything locally and dispersed support for everything will probably not get us where we need to be.
Thanks a lot, Julia. Alberto, do you want to comment very, very briefly on that?
Yes, thank you, Vincenzo. Well, much has been said, and I agree on most of the points the previous speakers have already mentioned. I'm just going to insist on three ones. The first is the need to engage in a constructive dialogue with industry, and that actors from upstream and downstream the value chain interact, and they are all on board to reach the goals of this CHIPS Act. And that has already been mentioned by Martin at the beginning and then by Jürgen. Then with regards to the governance structure, Lucilla's intervention was very clarifying in the sense that we share that industry has a role in feeding the decision-making process within the European Semiconductors Board, and also as part of the Industrial Alliance on Semiconductors, that whose kickoff we are all expecting with great interest. Then I'd also like to say that industry is crucial to detect trends and monitor the demand in the semiconductors value chain. And in this regard, although nowadays the automotive and industrial sectors are the biggest end markets for semiconductors in Europe, the uptake of AI systems will transform the sectors and alter the needs. And in order to monitor the pace of this uptake, we need industry to take into account the adopting measures. And my final remark will be about a point that hasn't been mentioned, which is that we should not forget about standards, because their role in reaching the goals is pivotal. Industry will be involved in the process for developing standards for the certification of chips, and that is part of the 2022 annual work program for European standardization. So we should also take that into account. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this point. We have time for a last question, and I would like to ask it to Lucilla, coming from the audience. How can we ensure that R&D activities and semiconductor production investments that will come out thanks to the CHIPS Act are not affected by extraterritorial restrictions to supply chains?
Well, the investments that will take place in research and innovation will mostly be implemented through the joint undertaking. We have a joint undertaking, which is now called Key Digital Technologies, which we propose to be renamed the CHIPS Joint Undertaking, but which will continue managing most of the research and innovation that we do in the European Union. It is a very interesting joint undertaking because it has not only the Commission and industry as part of the undertaking, but also the member states and also participating states, meaning associated states that go beyond the European Union and which can participate to the program. And it uses the rules of Horizon Europe, and in the future it will also manage the Digital Europe program. And therefore the possibility for third European countries to non-European countries to participate to the program of research and innovation and capacity building is shaped by the rules of participation of Horizon Europe and the Digital Europe program. So, which are pretty open programs, in particular compared to many others that exist in the world. So I think that there is no risk that we really exclude important players. And then on top of that, I want to remember that our collaborations with like-minded countries, United States in the TTC, but also Japan, for example, they often foresee also collaboration in the area of research. So that door is always very open on the side of the European Union. If I can just make a very last remark, if I'm given this possibility, I would like to pick up a point that was made by Alberto just now, and that it's very important also to address the comments made by our industry participants, because he highlighted the fact that artificial intelligence is going to bring new challenges, to the chips industry and to the way the chips are made. And actually one impact of artificial intelligence is going to be that the designs of the chips are going to be be very tailored to the use of the particular chips. And therefore this is going to bring much more closer the verticals, whether communications, healthcare, or industrial automation or automotive, to the chip makers. So I think this is an important trend for the future that we also have to keep in mind when we discuss the CHIPS Act and the future of this industry. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lucilla, for this comment. And with this, I would like to thank all panelists for this discussion. We now need to close the panel. This is really a broad topic, and we really see this as a first discussion on this CHIPS Act. And we would like to continue the dialogue with you to cover other topics that we could not address today. And with that, I would like to give the floor to our Director for Digital Transformation, Ray, for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo, and to all panelists. I'm going to attempt to give you a whirlwind tour of what we discussed. I'd like to thank the 400 participants who joined us. I think overall, we've heard lots of support for the CHIPS Act and positive comments to you, Lucilla, that have been reassuring to industry and member states on the coordination needed to react to this crisis. So bravo to you. We opened with Martin, who was highlighting the 4 important areas that we as Digital Europe and with members like ZVEI, where we need to clarify the terms and conditions in Pillar 1. We have the eligibility criteria for the first-of-kind semiconductor facilities. We need to clarify those. We need a central entity, not 27 different entities in member states to work with. And we need more industry involvement, which was an important point that we were concluding in this discussion. When we moved to Stefano in Italy, he was very much talking about the important integration function that the CHIPS Act can play, in particular in attracting investments, which will require legal certainty. And we need competition and a level playing field, particularly with the member states and research institutes, and strike that right balance in the ecosystem. Looking at Sweden, there was a view that the first-of-a-kind facilities will need to work globally. So how will that work? And how can it be open to the world? Subsidies should move with care. There are state aid rules that work, and we should not undermine them. And also, regulators will need training and expertise to ensure that they're producing better policy making. Ricardo from Intel was highlighting that the CHIPS Act can turn around the decline in production that we've been seeing and mobilize investment. Talent and skills is important. We need that pipeline. We need faster procedures for permits. We shouldn't have to wait years to set up shop. And we need financial instruments such as tax credits, which are working very effectively in many countries outside of the EU. And partner internationally. There's the TTC, which came up concurrently several times in this discussion to build a resilient supply chain. Lucilla, with your opening comments, you were talking about the first-of-kind chips that will produce at lower nodes, which is important, but we can innovate for functionality, and we can innovate for sustainability. And these areas should offer many opportunities for investment. Long-term investment for innovation in the EU should be impacting the economies and the ecosystems positively, and that is what you're looking for, particularly where we can strengthen design capability. When we went to Spain, we were seeing that there is a need to reduce dependency, securing open supply chains, which will be important, and trusted supply chains that can remove bottlenecks. That will need a monitoring body to look at those issues. And we should avoid clashes with free market rules and be aligned with international rules. Nokia, Julia, was talking primarily about the crisis response, and that this is going to be a need to invest not just locally, but globally. And information reporting obligations should be streamlined, centralized, again, not in 27 member states, and needs to be practical, not political. Daphne brought a different perspective, life-saving technologies from, looking at Philips. These are equipment that has had chips down by 70 to 90%. It's hard to see the bottlenecks. We need coordination mechanisms, but we need to design it carefully. Second and third generation chips are still very much important and need to have a focus. And the one important message that should resonate after this is that we can't wait. We need to act now. We need the member states to come together, and Lucilla responded very effectively to that, saying that work has started to work with the member states. They're looking to map, the needs. There is a survey out there. Healthcare chips needs a more central role to bargain, for these chips, and they will be, moving forward, of course. And they were inspired by how the U.S. has reacted to the crisis, as well as the problems of COVID. We went back to Sweden to see the need for international cooperation for crisis avoidance, and I think that's a very important word or phrase, I should say. And Italy still sees a risk of shortage for mature chips that are very much important for industry. We can't make this permanent, and we can't have the dependencies being permanent. Jürgen from Texas Instruments highlighted the importance that we have to prepare for the future. More must be done, and the communication with manufacturers and downstream users does not necessarily need government intervention. But what we do need is a role, a direct role, and say, in important things like the Semiconductor Alliance, and Lucilla, you addressed that in your closing points, that this group will meet and there will be opportunities for industry to be there. But I think we need more than just the occasional intervention with the Alliance. I think we need probably a strong permanent role in that as well. And there's a lot in industry that are not a part of that. So we need to fix that. Lucilla, you did talk about the need for investment for Pillar 2. That is clear. And industry should definitely look at that and step up. And then for Pillar 1, we have to set up these pilot lines, with the RTOs. I just want to close with one important comment that Lucilla made, two important ones, I think. There is a role for the TTC. There is an international role in R&D. We should use these areas, with like-minded countries such as Japan and other countries that we're working with to do that. And AI will bring a set of challenges. This will mean that design needs to work closely and be tailored with the verticals. So we will see a trend where the makers and those verticals in healthcare and automotive, et cetera, will be coming closer together, and we should encourage that. So I want to thank everyone very much for tuning in. We covered a lot in 90 minutes. This is recorded and will be shared. We didn't answer all your questions, so we do apologize. But this will be the first of many interventions that Digital Europe aims to lead and aims to coordinate with industries around and stakeholders. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good day.